Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy. I welcome you to my session. As per the requests of a few of our learners, I'll be recording this session. In our previous sessions, we had a discussion on a few of the most important modernist poems prescribed for detailed study as part of our syllabus. So we had a detailed overview and analysis of W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming and T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi. So in this particular session, we'll focus our attention towards war poetry of the 20th century. That is, we'll study a specific poem titled The Unknown Citizen, written by W.H.Auden. So I'm very sure that most of you might not be familiar to war poetry in English literature of the 20th century. Before we move further, let's have a quick overview on what war poetry is. War poetry is a literary genre which originated during the First War period, that is First World War era, when hundreds of both soldiers and civilians who had experienced the brutality and fury of the war started to write poetry in order to express their emotions. Emotions in the sense tragic, bitter emotions at the time of the war and their experience of the war. So war poetry started as a consequence of the writings of a few of the soldiers and civilians. Remember, war poetry is not just a World War phenomenon of the 20th century. It had been written from the very early times of the Greeks. But what is new is the establishment of war poetry as a literary genre. Remember, there have been war poetry even before during the time of Greeks, but it is only after World War I that the war poetry began to be established as a specific literary genre. So the 20th century witnessed very many wars. For example, the Spanish Civil War that happened between 1936 and 1939. Of course, the First and Second World Wars. We know about that. The Cambodian War that happened between 1968 and 75. So civilians and soldiers with their respective experiences of their involvement, direct or indirect involvement in the war, and belonging to different nationalities contributed to war poetry, which became some of the defining texts of 20th century Europe. We described World War II as a global war as many countries were involved in it. As you must have studied as part of world history, World War II took place between 1939 and 1945. It was between Germany, Italy and Japan. Remember, these three were known as the Axis powers on one hand, and the opposite team or the allies comprised of the US, France, Britain and the USSR on the other side. So this was a period of great watershed. So war poetry should not be misread as anti-war alone. It is about the very large question of life as well. Other themes such as identity, innocence, guilt, loyalty, courage, compassion, humanity, duty, desire, all others are relevant to war poetry. The significance of war poetry lies in its ability to use both historical consequences and political consequences as it speaks for the individual and not for the nation. So right now it is of great importance for you to have an idea regarding some of the most renowned war poets. With a bit of common sense, you can name one, obviously W.H.Auden. Who were the others involved in war poetry? Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, Siegfried Sassoon, Herbert Read, Robert Graves and others. Never forget to mention W.H.Auden because we are studying The Unknown Citizen, a piece of poem written by W.H.Auden. So moving on to the life and works of W.H.Auden. He was born in England. If you want to mention the year, it was in the year 1907. Later he migrated to the United States, and as a consequence he is often known as an Anglo-American poet. He hails from a very educated family. An important aspect to keep in mind that he cannot be compared with the legacy of T.S. Eliot or W.B. Yeats, who wrote masterpieces such as The Wasteland or The Second Coming for that matter. But Auden receives the status of modernist poet along with Stephen Spender, Cecil Day Lewis and others who belong to a generation of English poets from the 1930s. We will study them in detail when we discuss Stephen Spender's poem as part of the next unit. So Auden and his Oxford contemporary poet Stephen Spender introduced new themes that have become a part of modernist poetry of the 20th century. So remember, Auden and Spender are connected. We'll discuss more aspects in the next session when we discuss Stephen Spender. Now moving on to this poem as such, under section 15.2 you have the entire text. Make sure that you read and understand. Due to time constraints, I am not reading out the poem as such. I'll help you with a detailed summary and analysis. Before we move on to the textual analysis as such, let me help you with a brief overview. This poem tells us about the existence of an average citizen who is unknown to the entire community. Hence, this particular poem by W.H.Auden explores the unknown citizen through the viewpoint of various federal authorities and how this unknown citizen was never seen or heard by anybody. So this is a poem in 32 lines and there is no stanza division. It is simple, direct and uncomplicated. So this poem and the themes presented relates to our times where the discordance between the state and the people is quotidian experience, in the sense relates to our day-to-day experience. So regarding the form of this particular poem, you need to know that this is an elegy. You must have studied what an elegy is. An elegy is a song or poem expressing sorrow or lamentation, especially for one who is dead. Lycidas is an elegy. You must be familiar with other elegies too. But here the interesting aspect is that this poem is written in the form of a satirical elegy. What do you mean by a satirical elegy? Before that, are you familiar with the word satire? Satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity. So this is used in literature as if a technique. So this particular poem can be considered as if a satirical elegy. A satire is a literary form in which human or individual vices, follies and shortcomings are criticized by means of ridicule, irony, parody, caricature, burlesque or other methods. So in a satirical elegy, the elegy is used to make it perform a task directly opposed to its intended purpose. That is, there is this subversion happening here. It is a satirical elegy, that is, elegy is used to make it perform a task which is opposed to what is intended. Alright, that is meant by a satirical elegy. Here in this poem titled The Unknown Citizen, W.H.Auden laments the loss of man's individuality. How does he lament? By making him conform to the rules laid down by government or society to ensure its smooth running. So the unknown citizen never deviates from these norms and therefore government has no complaints to make against him. But in reality, a man's life is so much more than mere compliance to set rules. Such life negates all experience of human powers, emotions, desires and wants. So who is the speaker here? From language and content of the poem, I'm very sure that it is possible to understand that the speaker he must be a bureaucrat who addresses the elegy to form of address by the heard but unseen voice of the speaker sets the tone of the poem. That is, he must be a bureaucrat who addresses the elegy to an individual, referring to him in a very unique way. So if you look at the very first line of this poem, you could see to JS bar 07 M378. So it is not the name that is mentioned, but it is a code which has numbers and alphabets in it. So this speaker, the spokesman, addresses this elegy to an individual JS07 M378. It is not the name that is mentioned, which is quite significant. So this form of address by the heard but unseen voice of the speaker sets the tone of the poem. It is impersonal because there is no subjective mention. It lacks sensitivity and empathy too. So the speaker represents the faceless, indifferent and ruthless bureaucrat of the state or the government. So this person exerts his authority on the nameless citizen. Hence the name the unknown citizen. The citizen here is nameless. The individual, that is JS bar 07 M378, is deprived of his individuality in such a way that he can only be recognized by various government agencies that keep track of his life to make sure he is a willing subject, totally obedient to the powers above him. He has been subjugated to that matter. So the nameless and faceless individual is shown as a model citizen. There lies the star. Okay, he is shown as if a model citizen who is willing to abnegate his individuality to conform to the ideals set out by the state or government, to hold on to its authoritarian power. So in a way, it is the everlasting conflict between people and government that is portrayed here. Influenced by Marxian ideology, Auden in his works highlight contemporary issues overlaid by totalitarian government. This is something that you can mention, that is, W.H.Auden seems to be influenced by Marxism and Marxian ideology put forth by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels for that matter. So if you look at page number 23, a few lines are also given. If there are annotation questions for your examination, make sure that you learn and identify these lines as if from this particular work. The faceless citizen, that is this unknown citizen, does not suffer from any social tension and psychological abnormality. That is how he is being portrayed. So he follows all the norms that the society has laid upon. He is very friendly, he enjoys a drink in the company and is a regular reader of a newspaper. And it reflects the state's view and accepting it without any such questioning. So he pays his insurance policies and follows investment plans and follows whatever the state decides in terms of peace and war. So he is represented as one among the multitudes of people to live a faultless life as the state desires. So by the two end lines, the two last lines reveal the mechanical, stagnant life where he remains emotionally sterilized and paralyzed, transported almost into a robot. That is, by following all these, he becomes very mechanical in nature. So the last few lines are very significant. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. So the unknown citizen has submerged his thinking mind and feeling heart to the norms that society and the state have deceased or decreed as those of an ideal citizen. His intellect and his emotions have been dwarfed by the macro power of the state. Yeah, what you need to remember is that the poem ends on a mysterious note, a cryptic note that had he been unhappy, had he rebelled against its slavery to the state, we would have heard a different story, far from the elegy spoken in praise of the unknown citizen for not leading an exemplary life as the state had deemed. That is, if he had rebelled against his slavery to the state, the story would have been different. So, in short, we can say that the unknown citizen describes the average citizen, the common man who leads a life deemed utopian by the state, and in reality it is a dystopian life, quite opposite, as he abdicates his thinking and feeling faculties to remain impassive as required by the state. So he was a robot of the state in a matter of fact. So the standardization prescribed by the state saps human desire for freedom to think, feel, express, act, and live without tickling the right boxes. This is what is mentioned in the study material. That is why Auden reasons that for the modern man living in the war-torn 20th century, freedom and happiness are absurdities. It's quite hard to find these aspects. All that matters is to be a conformist and remain a conformist. Conformist in the sense conforming to the principles and rules set by the state. The state will erect a monument to one who did the right thing as decided by the state. This monument is at the beginning of the poem, dedicated to an unknown citizen, a faceless, emotionless, mindless man. So there lies the significance. Remember, this is a satirical elegy. Now, before we conclude the session, let's quickly discuss Auden as a modernist poet. There could be a short question based on this aspect. The probability of there being an essay question is quite less. Nevertheless, let's not skip this aspect. We'll discuss that. The form and content in Auden's poetry reveal the qualities of modernism. Nevertheless, you need to remember that not all aspects of modernism is seen in this particular piece of poetry. Yet, we can find a few. Remember, we discussed the features of modernist poetry in another lecture as part of block 1. Yes. So, in this particular piece of poem, we can see the idea that love is fleeting. Fleeting in the sense lasting for a very short time. We can see theme of horror in modern life, theme of death, theme of bureaucracy and totalitarianism. The last 3 lines can also mean the theme of suffering. So while in general Auden's poems deal with death and totalitarianism, he is also known for his love poems. Remember that. You may read this aspect from the study material. So this poem is in 4 stanzas. The poem that is mentioned is The Funeral Blues. Okay, a quick overview of this poem is also given there. Make sure that you read this aspect from your study material. I'll give you an overview of some of the characteristics of modernist poetry as we see in W.H.Auden's poem. Modernist poetry is written in simple language, that is the language of everyday speech. Just give me a minute, it's raining. Let me close the windows and come. Yeah. Point number 2, modernist poetry is highly intellectual. That is, it is written from the mind of the poet and it addresses the mind of the reader. See, I'm not explaining this much because we've already discussed this as part of another lecture. Modernist poetry is pessimistic. We saw that clearly in W.B. Yeats. See, these points you can also slightly alter and use in case of W.B. Yeats if you feel like it suits the poem as such. And it is suggestive. Modernist poetry is suggestive. The poem may suggest different meanings to different readers. This is a common aspect in most of the modernist poems. 5. Modernist poetry is cosmopolitan in the sense It appeals to readers everywhere and at every time because it deals with the problems of humanity as such. 6. Interest in politics and political problems of the age and the problems of average man and the lower classes. This is especially seen in Auden's poems in particular. Experimentation. So this is one of the important characteristic features of modernist poetry. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland is a quintessential example. Irregularity of form. We discussed that in detail. This is seen in most of the modernist poems. Here in particular, W.H.Auden has experimented with free verse, blank verse, the ballad meter, etc. Remember, even the addresser and the addressee has significance here in this particular piece of poem. In general, you need to know that modern poetry addresses the modern man of sensibility who lives in a state of spiritual and intellectual skepticism. Individualism is a key element in modernist literature where the individual is given more focus than the society. So these are some important aspects to keep in mind. To summarize, this particular poem that we discussed today, The Unknown Citizen, fits easily into the trends of modernist literature, and it also highlights the problems that people face. So if they ask you to analyze this particular literary work as if a modernist poem, you may make use of these poems to evaluate the poem and to substantiate your answer. As far as I know, there wouldn't be an essay question as such, but you never know. What if they ask you a question? For that matter, you need to be prepared. You know that there are not many previous papers available, so you better be prepared. So in this particular session, we discussed an overview regarding war poetry with specific focus on W.H.Auden, and we discussed in detail The Unknown Citizen, a very important poem, a modernist poem written by W.H.Auden. So that's all for today. I suppose you understood. In our next session, we'll deal with the next unit, Unit 16, which deals with Stephen Spender and his poem titled, I Think Continually of Those Who Were Truly Great. So thank you for joining me today.